Hello and welcome to this episode of the Millis Podcast, a show about ideas, books and events from the Christian intellectual scene in Australia and beyond. I'm your host, Simon Kennedy. I'm the director of the Millis Institute and senior lecturer in humanities at Christian Heritage College in Brisbane. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. And I'm joined today by Dr. Michael G. Thompson, or Mike Thompson, who is lecturer in history at Australian Catholic University, and he's based up here in Brisbane at the Banyo campus. Michael's first book, For God and Globe, Christian Internationalism in the United States Between the Great War and the Cold War, was published by Cornell University Press in 2015. He's currently working on another book exploring responses to environmental, geopolitical and economic turbulence in the 1930s, as well as researching the thought of Reinhold Niebuhr. His work is historical. It focuses primarily on the history of Christianity and the intersections between Christian intellectual movements and broader political and social movements. Michael, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure, Simon.
First, do you want to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, because our audience probably don't know much about you. As people might pick up with your slight accent, you're a Kiwi, but you've also worked in a curious and wide range of higher ed institutions. So do you want to tell us more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I am a Kiwi, and I think living here in Moreton Bay has brought out my Kiwiness a bit more. This is kind of like little New Zealand up here. So I live just north of Brisbane in the Redcliffe Peninsula, and every second grocery store has a little New Zealand section. So you can buy your pineapple lumps, your bluebird chips, French onion dip, your L&P, and you're happy. And those snacks haven't changed, by the way, since I was a kid in New Zealand in the 1980s. So it's very nostalgic. I think Kiwis love nostalgia, and I'm one of them.
It could be more, New Zealand than New Zealand is, right? Potentially.
I think it is. It's like one of those enclaves that's more the home place than the home place. So yeah, that's me. But I think it is, a lot of nostalgia, probably because I've actually spent way more time in Australia. So I moved over when I was 8 or 9 to Sydney, basically grew up in Sydney, going to schools there, a range of Christian and public schools. And then I think, basically from about the age of 18, 19, 20, I had a really strong desire and sense of call to study theology. But also as I went into university, a love of history. It was actually my worst subject in high school, I've got to say. I did a lot better in maths than history. And my teacher just had it in, you get into those loops where your teacher just decides you're not good and just keeps giving you low marks. I think university history was a whole different deal, and I really enjoyed it, and eventually decided to focus on that instead of the accounting degree I thought I should do. So I was enrolled in accounting for a while.
Phew, you dodged that bullet, mate.
Yeah. I actually worked in it for a while I was even doing history on it. I was doing tax returns on the side. But yeah, that was just really formative. And yeah, it sort of crystallized this desire to work both in theology and history and at the intersection of them. And I didn't quite know, and maybe still don't, how exactly that interface works, but I definitely felt some kind of call to work at that interface, and by call, I guess I mean that's where my sort of opportunities had opened up, where I really enjoyed working, and there was fruitfulness, and I found some wonderful mentors. One who only recently died, Dr. Neville Meaney at the University of Sydney, was a mentor, a real true intellectual mentor of the old sort. He would have his graduate students over for Irish stew and red wine and reading of papers by twilight down in Balmain. And he was a wonderful mentor to me. And actually his course was provided a way into the study of, you mentioned in the intro, Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian. And I was studying US history, which was curiously enough, I say curiously enough because it's in Australia, but in the university sector, it's reasonably well known that University of Sydney has a strong US studies and US history research and teaching strand, and that's sort of what I was formed in. I was studying US history, US foreign policy, but also really interested in the history of Christianity, even as an undergraduate, and all that came together under Neville Meaney, and he encouraged me to do my honours project on Reinhold Niebuhr, and it was, for me, that was just like Christmas and dessert all in one. It was like I could study a theologian, I could study US intellectual life and foreign policy and the theology of that in this turbulent era. So Niebuhr, for those who don't know, his name is German, but he was from German extraction, but born and raised in the United States, and became, a sort of mongrel theologian, if you like. That's how he called himself, a mongrel amongst thoroughbreds, but also more conspicuously, a kind of public intellectual that's hard to find parallel for, I think, in the present climate. Yeah. A public intellectual who had a strikingly prescient voice on US world affairs, foreign policy, American nationalism. He was a way of being a friendly critic and a theological, well, sometimes not so friendly, sometimes there's a kind of prophetic fire to his work, which I really loved, sort of puncturing the pretensions of American nationalism. And this was in the early Bush years, around the time President Bush was calling for the invasion of Iraq, and the whole ethos among policymakers in the United States sort of blended evangelicalism with neoconservatism. And there was this really strong, in fact, it's well remarked by many people, even in Eugene Peterson's biography of all places, it only came out last year. He was called to the Bush White House to do some chaplaincy work, and the thing that he came away with, being impressed by, was a disturbing sense of messianic sensibility among the policymakers. And that's what I was picking up on. And I was reading a book by Reinhold Niebuhr. I don't know if you've read it, Simon, The Irony of American History. It's a classic, and it felt like it could have been written about 2003 when it was written in in the late 1940s, early 1950s. I think it was 52.
Yeah,
was that prescient. And so, for that year, I just got to deep dive into Niebuhr's work, and Neville Meany helped me with that kind of intellectual biographical method. So taking, I think, sort of entering into their shoes at a point in time, and then watching and feeling even how the world crises of the 20s and 30s undid a lot of what Niebuhr thought were the Christian ethical commitments.
Yes.
So, for example, pacifism. Almost every good Christian thought that pacifism was the way to express your Christianity in public in the 20s, as well as prohibition. Prohibition and pacifism were the two big things in the US in the 20s. And and then in the 30s, you watch Niebuhr having to just undo himself.
Yeah. And
by 1939, 1940, writing this devastating paper, Why I Am Not a Pacifist, or Why the Christian Church is Not Pacifist, I think the title was. Yeah. And having to sort of lead the Christian public he had helped form and lead toward a pacifist direction, now to say that there's something worse than war, and that is Nazism and Hitlerism, and basically the destruction of a historic civilization. And then he had to argue that without idolizing that. And some of his theology of national idolatry, I still think, is remarkable in that period. So in his Gifted Lectures, and those listeners might know the Gifted Lectures, very well-known series in Edinburgh, and Niebuhr gave them in 1939, and they were published in the early 40s. And the sort of theology of the nation state, how to get engaged in the pragmatics of politics, where you have to choose between relative goods, relative bads, and yet not idolizing the nation, like that messianic sense we were talking about earlier. He just really, I think, had some deep insights into that, and was very involved in the early ecumenical movement. So I am still trying to answer your question, by the way. That was no,
but it's great. It's great. Yeah. It's helping explain this. It's helping explain, I guess, where we want to go in a little while, which is this interest in modern Christian intellectual history. But you're still on your honours thesis, so you
it won't be equally proportionate. Don't worry. So that also provided just a foothold to get to then stay on, matriculate into a PhD program at Sydney Uni. Slightly different supervision arrangements. I certainly stayed in contact with Neville throughout the process, but had a wonderful set of supervisors who were more trained in social and cultural history, and I think the way they used sources was really compelling to me, and I think was a really good influence, kind of a complement to that traditional approach of sort of great thinkers and great books. So they got me doing, I think, a far more granular excavation of the movement around Reinhold Niebuhr. And if I had to sum up how that PhD project, which became Forgotten Globe, the book you mentioned, that it started with the first year that the task my supervisor, Stephen Robertson, set for me was basically just to deep dive into this archive of a journal that Niebuhr co-edited with fellow Christian pacifists and socialists in New York City in the 20s and 30s, chart it from the 20s into the 30s. And, so I remember before technology was quite where it's at now, having literally scanning thousands and thousands of pages of this crumbling journal and then turning the characters into optically recognizable characters, so I could piece together across those pages kinds of groups and characters and movements and conversations that we otherwise wouldn't have an archive for. That's the journal, if you're interested, was called The World Tomorrow.
Oh yes, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, in its time, it was really famous. It conducted all these sort of polls, actually, in the very early history of polling. It tried to crystallize what American clergy thought about war, peace, depression, unemployment, things like that. And it published, the Prime Minister of England. It published Gandhi at times. It was a really interesting place. And it tried to, it was sort of part of this liberal, ecumenical, pacifist social gospel. But it was sort of a birthplace for what intellectual historians in the US would call Christian realism. This change in ethical sensibility of what it means to be a Christian in, taking an ethical stand in public. So Niebuhr became synonymous with that Christian realism. But I was sort of trying to get wider than him and sort of relativize his stature in some ways, put him back in context. And it also took me into sort of the early origins of Christian support for the United Nations, and not just support for, but sort of active formation of in the mid-1940s around the Commission for a Just and Durable Peace in the United States. So that was the book. And then still on the agenda was the theology side of the equation, and opportunities came to do what I'd long hoped to do, and that was to go to sort of leave the treadmill of academic history. I was doing a lot of sort of contract lecturing in US history, learning a lot by teaching, and it's the best way to learn, just across all parts of US history and bits of other history as well, in Australian and also environmental history, histories of law and crime and punishment, all sorts of things. And it was very rich, but the opportunity came to study at SMBC in Sydney and Croydon. And that was kind of a little bit of an experiment at first, but after 1 year I decided that's it, I'm all in. I want to study theology full time. I know it means probably leaving the academy, but I want to explore whether pastoral ministry is where we ought to go. And so I had 3 young kids. It's a great place to have young kids. We even had our 3rd baby there. You get kind of lots of people around you. There's meals made, and you have to pay for them, but it's actually a surprisingly great place to be a young, to have a young family, to be together. But also, intellectually and spiritually wonderful, an extraordinary privilege just to spend a few years digging deep into biblical languages. It was quite a world away from the things I'd been doing. There was very little discussion of 20th century intellectual history. It was just, mastering Greek exegesis of the New Testament and thinking through systematic theology in a very broad sense, and church history in a kind of 2,000 years covered in 12 months of survey, that sort of thing. Very, very different to what I was used to. And towards the end of that, again, the question was still there: how is this going to all come together? And then I think I've shared with you, Simon. I don't want to go into detail here, but there were a range of doors that opened and closed. Some more in the church setting. Some I did work in the seminary setting in Brisbane School of Theology for a year, which was a great pleasure. And then unexpectedly, an invitation to work back in the university setting came across my path, and that was a big decision to sort of weigh out how this is going to go together. But so I think, I kind of had to do a little bit of what we've been doing today, reflect on that trajectory, reflect on what and where I could contribute best. And I think the thing about the job I'm in now, which is in history at ACU, is it does kind of, very concretely, I get to spend half my week researching history of Christianity and writing in that space, and then the other half teaching all sorts of parts of history, US history. The history of Christianity is very much part of that, but there is, I think, something I really appreciate about that dynamic, in that it keeps bringing up things from history, ethical problems, historical issues, just a sort of awareness that is constantly challenging my faith in a good way, like in a stimulating way. That, what does this mean? How do I respond to that? And it's kind of like sailing into a headwind, but that headwind is energizing and sort of keeps propelling the boat forward, at least for me. So I kind of had a sense that might be how I was wired, and I don't imagine it would be as stimulating for everyone. And there's lots of great work. Like, I really esteem the work that BST are doing and have been doing, and equally the churches I've been involved in. I have enormous respect for the pastors there. So it's not that I value one over the other, but when I had to sort of think, where can I make a contribution? This present role seemed to be the most, the one that my wife and I, after reflection, thought, this is probably the one we ought to take. And so it's been a few years settling in there. It meant relocating to little New Zealand up on Watts Bay, and meeting folks like you in Brisbane. So I had no exposure to Brisbane at all.
Right.
And to people who were working in history of Christianity, or as you say, in the Christian intellectual scene, it was quite fresh, apart from my contacts at the seminary, Brisbane School of Theology. So it's been a great pleasure to get settled in up here and continue to find ways to dig some roots, hopefully for the longer run, in terms of using this present role in history to keep pursuing that inquiry, that interface of theology and history that we began with in the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Your own story is really informative in terms of different journeys that people can take in intellectual life and the life of the mind in the academy. And it's not always clear where you're going to end up. I wasn't expecting to end up where I am either, but here we both are up in Brisbane, and pursuing things that we love and enjoy very much. And it's a privilege to be in the positions we're in at the end of the day, I think. So, thanks for sharing that. That's really, really helpful and very, very interesting and encouraging. Now, I guess to circle back a little bit to that broader question of Christian history and Christian intellectual history, if you will, and the focus, there's been a bit of an uptake in interest, I think, around the history of particularly modern Christianity. Mark Noll's book, which I have just here on hand, The Scandal of the Evangelical Minds, a kind of path-breaking seminal work in terms of interrogating the connections between evangelical culture and the broader culture, and the kind of work that you do. And then, a more recent example, again, which I have here, is Dumez, Jesus and John Wayne, and that kind of question around like the connections between evangelical Christian culture and, say, Trumpism, or there are a range of things that people are interested in. What do you think is driving the growth in this? It's kind of a cottage industry in a sense. This interest in Christianity, the Christian intellectual scene, if you will, and then these broader trends, particularly in the United States. What is your take on what's happening there in terms of the interest around this stuff?
Well, I'm pleased to know there is interest, because for me, I've been burrowing away for almost 20 years. Mark Noll's book comes out of he's a remarkable figure in that history himself. He's a historian. His journey as both an evangelical person, but a scholar committed to the highest quality and rigor in his discipline, and I think broadly from a reformed background, led him to help establish that cottage industry. With another historian called George Marsden at the University of I'll say it American, Notre Dame. One in Indiana. So that's similar ethos to, although probably slightly more confessionally conservative in the way they view their mission, but it's a similar ethos to ACU. Obviously, it's more an elite and sort of I think it would be considered Ivy League. I might be wrong.
Probably technically not, but it's like it's sort of the Catholic Ivy League. Sort of
the Catholic, equivalent, yeah. But it's it's a research institution that prizes quality scholarship, and that remarkably chose to foster work on the history of evangelicalism. I think some of the best kind. So actually, Kristen Dumais, and I'll just point that in Dumais. It does.
Oh, it's Dumais. Sorry.
To say Dumais. It's all right. But it does. So she was trained there along with, say, Darren Dochak, who's another remarkable historian from that stable, and many others. If you went around faculty, say at Baylor University, you'd find people who were trained in this stable. So,
and there was a little group at Johns Hopkins as well that was that did some work there too for a while. Yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, DG Hart came out of Johns Hopkins, and there was a scholar there. I think he and a number of other people worked with. But anyway, that's by the by.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the thing. You do find research institutions like Hopkins or Notre Dame. They do have a profound influence on training a generation of historians. Or whatever the discipline is. I feel like Noel's book. So it was written in '95. It was hopeful about philosophy and mostly, and then a little bit hopeful about history. Yeah. But it kind of, I think what he was pointing out was that there'd been this lamentable scandal caused by the withdrawal of evangelicals in the early 20th century from mainstream intellectual institutions. And he and D.G. Hart, or whoever the person is at Hopkins, I'm not familiar with, are kind of exceptions to that trend. And again, it goes back to similar to my own. I mean, my example is in Australia and nowhere near as lofty as these other people. But there are these choices you make between whether you go into kind of a separate Christian land or whether you stay in mainstream academic life. And I think that to answer your question, part of it is a kind of sense of waking up from the 70, 80-year impact of choices made in the 1910s and 20s. So that and between the 10s and 30s, a lot of the exodus happened. That's when enormous battles took place in terms of American universities and seminaries, that between the so-called liberals or modernists on one side and those who were kind of more supportive, if not triumphalistic, of kind of 19th century scientism and so forth. And there was and I think this is still being echoed out today, this sense of something hostile has taken over our institutions, therefore we need to leave, start alternative institutions, and almost create an alternative intellectual infrastructure. They're the choices that we made. So I feel like Noel wrote that kind of, I mean, I'm not presumed to speak for him at all, but it seems in the book and in the context that was written that it's around the time I think he was about to join, or might have been, he joined Notre Dame some years later. But
he was at Wheaton. I think he was at Wheaton at the time.
That's right. Yeah. He was at Wheaton at the time, you're right. Maybe Marsden was already at Notre Dame.
Yeah, maybe.
But there's a sense, I think of, from my memory of the book, and it's been a little while since I've picked it up, but that there's a sense of lamenting that evacuation and the sort of unintended consequences that have come from it. And sort of, I think, where there's signs of hope, it's where people have been faithfully present in disciplines and have expressed their faith through a commitment to quality scholarship, not using their faith to shortcut the axioms of their discipline.
Right.
And I think that's the key thing. And so I feel like, so Noel's book kind of was almost could only have been written by him at that point, I think. I mean, George Marsden's work on fundamentalism in American culture did have some similar flavors to it. That was written in about 1980 and republished in the early 2000s, I think about 2005. So that was similar. But I don't know if the cottage industry as such extended or existed then, but I think you're right. Then Molly Worthen's book was, I think, a remarkable book. Apostles of Reason. I think I've got that on my shelf somewhere. But
and that's such a great book. Like it's
an incredible book. Yeah. And I think that is one of the finest of that sort of new era of people trained in intellectual and cultural history
Mm.
who are also dexterous and literate in the kind of religious history as well. So and Worthen writes really fine journalism as well, like long form journalism in terms of contemporary religion and politics and religious culture. So yeah, and I think she's part of the generation that Noel and others kind of nurtured. So more of my generation. And I think, there's more people coming through like Demay, Dochak and others who have, the training that was fostered in the discipline, in terms of quality. So I think Worthen was at Yale.
Yes.
And as we mentioned, Hopkins and Notre Dame. So these are quality research institutions where to get a doctoral qualification, you have to meet the standards of your discipline and, craft original work that uses evidence creatively, that's in dialogue with people you don't agree with. And it's very much the opposite of that kind of separation and creation of your own credentialing system.
Yes.
And I think, the fruit. So in part, I guess that is more of a supply question. There's more people able to do it.
Right.
A supply answer to your question. And then I think there is a demand factor with the Trump era, but I do feel like that's kind of epiphenomenal to the first. I think the supply for me is
I think that's right. Yeah, it was the Bush era. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, even the moral majority, even the 80s was a really interesting era, although it's probably in hindsight that was more interesting for historians because of the moral majority and so on. But yeah, the Bush era also kind of raised similar questions to what Trump did in a more acute way, perhaps. Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about the Bush era, because one of the things that happened was, and this relates to my own story. So up until now, I haven't actually made evangelicals the subject of my research, even though that's closer to my extraction, origin. I've always focused on liberal, mainline, ecumenical Protestants as a research subject, and they had an enormous uptick in interest in the Bush era. So there was a cottage industry of articles about the way that Reinhold Niebuhr had a cottage industry rebirthed in the 2007. So there's one classic one in the Atlantic Monthly in 2007 called A Man for All Reasons. And it basically surveys between 2004 and 2007 all the invocations of Niebuhr that came back on the scene 50 years after he was writing Irony of American History. And in that election of 2008, the sense of, President Bush's theopolitics can't be all that Christianity has to offer. It can't be the only public face of Christianity. It can't be the only way to think about foreign affairs. That there was this rush to invoke, to learn from Niebuhr. So they republished his Irony of American History. And Obama's on the dust jacket. And now I think in that election, Obama and Clinton, a lot of candidates started saying, I'm a Niebuhrian. It was like the coolest thing to be. So, and that was weird because I was probably had an unfair boost in some ways from that. When I'd just been working on Niebuhr for my honors thesis, and it was a curious cresting of interest. But so it seemed to draw people's attention to the liberal ecumenical line. And I've got to say, in terms of, if you look at US historical titles, just to go back to your question, actually the cottage industry was around that. So the works of David Hollinger is in his illustration. So he was the president of the American Historical Association and one of the best known intellectual historians, an avid atheist, and had worked on history of science, history of intellectual history in the United States, was probably, again, one, and he's been very generous to me in my work as well. Endorsed my book, for example. But his work was probably some of the most significant indicators of a cottage industry, or not cottage actually, just of a wide shift to becoming aware of the impact of other kinds of Christianity than evangelicalism and its deep kind of fabric, deep roots, deep influence and complex influences on all facets of US politics around the mid-century, and not just politics, but especially activism. So early civil rights. A lot of the kinds of things that in the longer run became associated with secularism or with a kind of secular liberal progressivism. Hollinger said, hang on, if we look at the ecumenical movement and missionaries in particular, he really drew our attention to mainline missionaries. He said a lot of this is actually coming out of the mission field in the 20s and 30s.
So interesting.
Feeding back into, so, and that's sort of where that was the locus where I was sort of working for most of the time before I went to seminary. And I still am with that in the current book. But so the Trump cottage industry sort of came after that.
Yeah.
And I think it's, I mean, if there's a demand question, like what do people want to know? It is, it is, where did this, it comes out of just fairly, a time of fairly extreme constitutional crisis, I think. And then questions behind that I think it's probably, I feel like it's too early to have fully digested and put in words to it yet, but there do seem to be still going on some extraordinary realignments. Well, I wouldn't have foreseen them 10 years ago, even 5 years ago necessarily.
No, but the realignment's significant. It's happening. It's almost unquestionable. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's a recent study that shows that mainline Protestantism is actually growing faster than evangelical Protestantism.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right. So, and a lot of that is evangelicals saying, I'm no longer wanting to be associated with that name. So they might not necessarily be changing. It might not be the way evangelicals would often tell it, is that these people are drifting away off into being sort of becoming hostage to contemporary liberalism. But the way that often these people from megachurch environments or so on are actually wanting to go more traditional, liturgical, and confessional within their Christianity, and they're actually seeing that the cultural fabric of white evangelicalism and the political expressions of it. This is where Jamay comes in, I think, arguing that what we're looking at claims to be theological. It's avowedly theologically driven, but it actually has, she's a specialist in gender history and historicizing gender. So she particularly looks at that impulse to reassert white masculine mastery, to that sort of sense of authoritarianism. And I think the realignments that are going on, people are wanting to know who moved the goalpost. Was it us? Or there's something about Trump era evangelicalism that, I think I would, as I say, it still feels very early to me and I'm not authoritative on it, but my sense is that the goalpost moving has been on the part of those more avid, they self-describe as conservative, but it's actually quite a radical departure, both from their confessional traditions and from even the tradition of US evangelicalism, which is kind of a non-traditional tradition.
Right.
Part of it also to work out where they are.
I mean, it's part of it, like you were talking about the demand issue. Part of it surely is, if we look back as historians on the 20th century, you would say that the mainline church was much more influential in the early, let's say the first half of the 20th century on America generally. And then that's declined since the middle of the 20th century, when one way or another, and the evangelical influence has grown. And in a sense, the last 20 years has seen some of the political fruit of that potentially. Again, I'm not authoritative on this, but this is just kind of a rough analysis. And so the historians being interested in, early 20th century historians are interested in mainline Christianity because that's what's doing a lot of the driving. That's what's, putting a lot of, they're doing a lot of the work, I guess, a lot of the cultural work. And then more recently, it's like you say, white evangelicalism. And so then that seems like as well a reasonable, I think, explanation for why there's a growth in that kind of industry. And maybe there's also, happily, an acknowledgement that actually religion and Christianity and theology does drive public policy, does drive political movements and so forth. And I think that's actually a good thing for historians to actually go, actually it really does. Even though we might say we're a secular society, broadly speaking, there's actually these undertows which just don't go away. And so, that's just another comment on what you were talking about, essentially.
No, I think that's right. I think that latter point is really important. That's what within not only history, but I think neighboring disciplines in political science and international relations, for example, and it could be others too. There was this enormous sort of what many called a religious turn in the Bush era, and it was a combination of 9/11 and the account that that religion was a factor in that. What was an enormous geopolitical intervention as well as an act of mass murder and so on. It kind of foregrounded the way that the assumed story of, and then you had Bush, quoting Bible verses in front of the Statue of Liberty to sort of lead America into. I remember him quoting the John 1, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." He's talking about the United States, but he's quoting a verse about Jesus.
That's right.
And that kind of fusion is there, and then all of a sudden these disciplines which had sort of woke up to their fact, and that you could follow this through many, many different journals. So in history, it was a huge deal at around 2005, 2007. All these articles come out saying maybe we were wrong about our implicit secularization thesis.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that we'd always bought the idea that as time went on and we became more developed, we'd become less religious, whatever that means, and we would, and so we could therefore just, the closer we got to the present, the less we had to account for religion as a form of public reason.
Yes.
It would almost swallowed John Rawls's idea, separation of public and private reason, that you keep your faith at home. These things had kind of become not so much normative as axiomatic. They've just been built into the structure of inquiry.
Exactly.
And so I think the Bush era is when I, at least in history and in disciplines that dealt with international life, like you could trace across the later part of that first decade of the 2000s an enormous outpouring. So Andrew Preston's work on religion and foreign policy was a major sort of field shape. I think that he released an article in Diplomatic History that surveyed basically why we need to pay more attention to religion.
Yep.
And then he kind of did that, met the need in a book called Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, which went kind of from colonial America to the present, and did just a remarkable job excavating the way that faith, whatever it is, forms presidents, policymakers, worldviews. There's so many different causal pathways for it to actually affect public life. So I feel like even before Trump came along, that was scholars at least were ready to just, of course, religion really matters. And I think in the Trump era, we've got to a point, at least in history, I think we should have got to a point, and I think we have, where it's not so much, we had to spend about 10 years saying, does religion matter?
Yes.
And the answer was yes. And now we are far more talking about what kind. And not just and also I think not just presupposing two separate things, like a secular sphere and religion over here. And sometimes does religion dare to come across the border and intervene? It's more like, actually, how are these two things mutually constituted in the first place? Like, are they even that separate? And what are the complex legacies that religion has had and still has in our civil religious structures?
Yes.
Whether it's Anzac Day or whether it's views about the environment or about the different kinds of political theologies. It's far more pluriform rather than there just being is that a word, pluriform?
Yeah, it is. I think it is.
It's variegated. There's lots of different ways that religion and politics and questions of sovereignty, questions of ownership, questions of temporality or sort of visions of temporality, the future. I think showing to be a very complex and kind of fascinating tapestry, even in our so-called secular age. Our so-called secular age. So that's the other thing. There was the whole work on secularization. I think really helped. Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, people actually, again, demanding far more nuanced accounts of so-called secular sphere and the way we deliberate as humans with each other about common good. So so it's a really I think within that the Trump cottage industry has sort of emerged a sort of one instantiation of it. And I think that'll come and go. Although I think Trumpism will be longer than Trump.
I agree, but maybe that cottage industry question is really very much just that, because it arises out of an acute historical moment, if you will, like to put it, for want of a better way of putting it, which requires some kind of analysis and explanation. How did we get here, and so on. And there are lots. I mean, there are lots of different explanations. Dumay's explanation is one sort of angle on it, but there are others as well. And I mean, like you said, it's not a question we can answer particularly. Maybe we can't answer it satisfactorily yet because it'll take time to really unpack that.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm interested in Australia and America at this point, because Australian Christianity doesn't have the same doesn't seem to have the same influence on public affairs as what it does in America, as American Christianity does. I guess there's a couple of parts to this question. One is, what are the parallels, do you think, between Australian evangelical intellectual culture and American evangelical intellectual culture? They seem different, but the histories are different, the countries are different, and so on. But there are analogies, I think, and whether some of the things that Noel observes are observable here. But this also links to an event so we're recording this on the 20th of July, 2021. So next week, you're actually hosting a workshop in Brisbane, which is actually entitled Intellectual Authority and Its Changing Infrastructures in North American and Australian Christianity, 1960s to the 2010s. So maybe if you want to try and answer that question, but also kind of, you could refer to the workshop, whether that's sort of linked and this comparative work that maybe could be done about America and Australia.
Absolutely. No, thanks for bringing that up, Simon. And that I think that workshop, so it's being held in Brisbane in person, but very much online, especially since
there's lockdowns everywhere.
The lockdowns everywhere, but Brisbane. So
people in the Northern Territory can come, but everyone else can't, pretty much.
Anyone north of the Queensland border. It'll be held largely online, but with a few of us.
I'll be there. I'll be there.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So I think that signals really that's an ongoing question. I think the workshop is really designed to start finding out how to ask good questions rather than answer them conclusively. And it's very easy to go for shorthand homologies, things that look the same,
that's right.
and make assumptions from them. I mean, that's one of the, not just with Christianity, it's one of the dangers in transnational and comparative history. I think it's a very valuable kind of history, but I've got one of my mentors who's a major figure in that disciplinary sort of emergence has written, I think, compellingly about that sort of impulse to take a like what looks the same and infer meaning from that.
Yes. A classic example of that, by the way, would be Morrison's kind of somewhat remarkable victory in the 2019 election. And then saying, he's the Australian Trump because he's on the right and he's a Pentecostal. I mean, Trump's not a Pentecostal, but he's a Pentecostal Christian and he's a bit of a populist, and he won an election that no one was expecting. Therefore, he's an Australian Trump. It doesn't. It's actually a ridiculous thing to say for so many reasons. The level of analysis is quite low if you're doing that kind of comparison.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so again, and it might be the historian part of me that's well, I mean, maybe not just the historian part. I was thinking about the theological part too, because
exactly.
the more time you have between the phenomenon and time to reflect and interpret and actually give careful thought to it, there's a time gap before we can be too conclusive. But you're right that it's tempting just to jump in and see, something called populism emerge, or So I wouldn't claim to have all the answers. I think we're trying to find how to ask good questions.
Yep.
We're trying to bring together scholars who look at the many different directions too. So often, and I think I would tend towards this because I'm a historian of the US. I'll intuitively tend to see stuff that happens in Australia that's connected as some kind of export-import. So the US exports, we import, and that there's a lot of in the 30s and 40s that I'm working. There's definitely times when that's true. But it's just as surprising the things that go the other way. So whether it's in, we're having a paper next week on certain kinds of creationism that have been exported from Australia to the United States. So that's Dr. Tom Aikner at UQ. It's one of our 4 keynotes. And I'm excited to hear what that, not just the paper itself, which sounds fascinating, but also the way that we might be able to all learn from that, paying attention to those possible dynamics. There's another speaker Dr. Paul Oslington will be speaking on Pentecostalism, and I think in a way that kind of bucks a lot of assumptions about demographics and levels of education and so forth that I'm especially looking forward to. And again, we've one of the major sort of church growth and music cultural exports that we've had to America has been Hillsong churches and Hillsong music, for example. So the traffic is thick, it's multi-dimensional, and I think it has been for one of our other speakers, Dr. Jeff Trelaw, I've been talking with him over the years about doing some work on the sort of 150-year history or more of US and Australian evangelicalism. I think we can draw some conclusions about, or not conclusions, but the hypothesis, I'd say, about the kinds of things that take root in the United States that don't take a stronger root here, or at least haven't to this point. So one of the most striking things, and this sort of comes partly from research and partly from experience, is the focus on eschatology or study of the end times. And what are the requirements to be considered orthodox? So my dialogue with colleagues in US based seminaries is that the level of specificity required to establish that yes, they're orthodox and kind of credentialed to teach in a seminary requires a lot more specificity around premillennialism or dispensationalism than in Australia. It wouldn't even be a question, right? So at most seminaries, it would be far more around your view of the Bible and the Bible's authority and the centrality of the atonement, that sort of thing. There are things like that. You've got to ask, what makes millennialism in general a really big deal there, but not here, even if we would be allies on so many other points. So I think there are kinds of there are historical questions still to be dug into there. But we can, there are sort of ready-made or readily apparent pathways in our respective intellectual histories of evangelicalism that do bring some of those contrasts to light. And I think our views of the state are another area where, and this might be something that's possibly going to change, but if we look back in time, our evangelicalism tended to be more influenced by a kind of middle of the road, state-friendly evangelicalism, if you like. Whereas the ethos
was more British. It was probably more British.
That's right. More British. That's right. Yeah, and British social Christianity, there wasn't as stark a polarization between social gospel on one hand and kind of
that's right,
fundamentalists on the other. And I think written into our, and also the thing glaring us in sort of glaringly obvious is the fact that the United States was unique in being a disestablished, not having an established church, whereas we have had both formal and semi-formal establishments.
That's right.
And which brings with it just I think a fairly different sort of deep-rooted sensibility with regard to the beneficence or malevolence of the state. And if you chart the kind of political theologies of the state, popular and sort of highbrow in the two countries, that in the United States at least, that sort of suspicion of centralized government being a fount of tyranny and of conspiracy, of some kind of malevolence, it's there for a lot more of the time, not all of the time. I think that early 20th century progressive era was, and through to the deal in the 1930s and 40s, certainly among mainline Protestants, less hostility. But then, evangelicals define themselves in reaction to that. So they start calling Franklin Roosevelt, who makes the government's role in life the biggest that it ever been to date, the Antichrist for doing that. Or they start seeing the United Nations, which other Christians are seeing as a way to try and prevent war in the name of Christ and turn swords into plowshares. And so they see that as, well, that's basically just the Antichrist and the Europe, there's forces of tyranny, of liberal humanism that are, and there's this kind of more threat-based suspicion, or threat-oriented suspicion of malevolent forces. And I think that's what we're seeing come more to the fore in some in the sort of fragmentation of the Trump era, we've seen certain parts, even in Australia,
and that kind of view. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That kind of view I would have thought is probably becoming more popular in Australian Christianity, in Australian conservative Christianity, where there's more of a, for want of a better term, like a libertarian right-wing view of the state that goes with some Christian brands of Christianity here, political Christianity, whereas the old Australian evangelicalism was basically old British evangelicalism, which actually was basically paternalistic in terms of its political culture. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, and it literally was, because you had 19th century British paternalistic Whiggism or liberalism and conservatism, like both people like there were both parties were paternalistic. Sort of both of those parties were paternalistic in Britain, and that was what was inherited here. And the Church of England, the culture of the Church of England and of the Wesleyan movement and so on are all kind of positive towards social, what we would probably call social justice, but it's not quite the right. I hate the phrase because it's a bit charged, but they were positive. They framed that positively, and the role of the church and the state in social welfare was, obviously a good thing for them by and large. Whereas,
absolutely, I think the term they used was amelioration.
Right. Yeah.
Social amelioration, which doesn't roll off the tongue.
Rather than justice. It's not a platonic form.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's right. And maybe it's a reflection of what I like the way you characterize that as that's right. The intention is this kind of, or the view anyway, the ideal is this beneficence, the paternalistic beneficence. And that's why amelioration works as a term for them. Whereas justice can presuppose more of a conflict model. And it's been taken up more by, sort of branches of Christianity that have stressed that conflict is the way to justice,
Yes.
Through the 20th century.
And so maybe but I guess I wonder whether maybe it'd be real. I mean, I'm interested to see what we learn next week. And as this line of research develops, and it's something I'm participating in myself.
That'd be excellent.
I'm seeing toward the end of the 20th century more Australians buying into American evangelical ideas. But maybe before that, it wasn't quite like that. It was quite, there's more contrast perhaps. So I think it's an interesting field, I think.
Well, that's right. I won't take too long on this, but that was actually a starting point of the conference's like reason or rationale and the application for the grant we made to the Religious History Association to kindly be able to host it. So the one of the rationales was a conversation I was having with Chris Mays. Dr. Chris Mays is
at Deakin University.
Deakin University, and trained in history, philosophy, ethics. He likes, his podcast, I'll plug, it's called Undisciplinary, and that's he crosses disciplines, right? And Chris and I were talking about this. We were both in our research picking up a shift where, and that's what we mean by intellectual authority. Where would Christians in Australia just look to institutionally as well? Where would they look to credential what's the Christian idea? And if you just took that 50-year passage from the 60s to the 2010, there's many things that go on about the idea of authority in general in the 60s, of course, and there's reactions that actually reinforce the critique of the new left inadvertently. There's lots going on. But one of the big things we could see as a hypothesis in his work is on the emergence of bioethics, is that there's this pivot towards a North American centeredness. So somewhere around the 70s and 80s, it seems there was it's hard to be too fine about the timing, and I think this is where Dumais' work on culture, the fact that she sees evangelicalism as constituted by what you can buy in a Christian bookshop and watch and listen on radio and watch on film.
I think that's a helpful part of her work, actually, to think that through like that.
Yeah, because that helps explain, so if people are born or come of age after the 60s, or they're going to a Christian bookshop in the 80s and 90s, that the proportion or the sort of center of gravity by the 90s seems to have shifted. You go in and you pick up Tim LaHaye on why the UN is the, it's a fictionalized account, but you're going to be, to the extent you're formed by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, that formation is going to lead you to view central government, universities, maybe even Frank Peretti, another example, a novelist who I was reading as a kid. Your doctor could be a demonic channel. Your
probably is actually.
Probably is. Yeah, that's right. And so those sorts of sensibilities toward the state, that sense of there being conspiracy afoot, I don't think have in our sort of religious DNA. For maybe it's there in smaller ways, but in terms of evangelical culture, white evangelical culture, I do think there's in Australia a turning to the United States as the kind of powerhouse, the sort of locus. And even though there are two-way currents, we do seem to want to credential our ideas by mechanisms that are based in the US. And I think there's a lot of history to be done on just and I think Dumais points in this direction, but just literally, like even I'm aware of some other work that doesn't deal with Christianity, but deals with US communications power. And there's asymmetries just in the way that late Cold War United States simply has the capacity to disseminate more of its information.
Right.
There's economic aspects, there's technical aspects.
Yeah.
And there's a whole international legal history, which I'm only just becoming aware of in terms of how the United States negotiates its right to basically send its information into other countries. So even before we get to the age of the internet, there are asymmetries in kind of US's ability to spread it, to have its citizens, including evangelicals, spread their ideas. And there is a recent interesting book I just reviewed. It's fascinating on this. One of the most remarkable chapters on 1970s evangelicals. So after Lausanne, and the author Lauren Turek. I think the title, sorry, it's eluding me right now, but it has sort of the Great Commission in the titles to make disciples or to spread good news to all nations. I'll have to listen to it. It's Lauren Turek, Turek, and it's got a remarkable chapter in there on like really detailed history of the take-up of communications technology on the part of US evangelicals in the 70s.
Fascinating.
So early satellite broadcasts, TV, radio, and particularly, with really self-conscious evangelistic aims in mind. And so that the sort of global projection of US culture in general is huge. I mean, obviously in the Cold War, it's a world historic phenomenon. The projection of US culture generally, and Australia's culture generally is turning more towards an orientation and affiliation. And there's a whole body of historiography on that. When Australians stopped thinking of themselves so much as British, and Britishness was Australianness, and when America, there's big debates. In fact, Neville Meaney, Hugh Chilton, you might know Hugh Chilton. Is very interested in these kinds of changing currents from the 60s on as well, and his work deals really well with these themes. So there's lots there to be done, taking up the directions raised by Hugh Chilton, by Lauren Turek, by Kristen Dumais. But I think there's a way in which certainly in Australia we are primed to be more receptive to things that maybe weren't kind of endemic to our Christian expressions of Christianity and its relation to the state. So we've kind of we've got a super abundance of Christian products that can kind of and I think not just products, they're people who offer who and this is something you and I have talked about and will come up next week. Someone like Francis Schaeffer, it's people who are in the business of apologetics, which is really a self-regulated business. It's not subject to any discipline. No. It is its own it's not a fabrication, it's its own crafting. So it's not answerable to academic theology. It's not answerable to history. But it often is in the marketplace what people will take to be the intellectual Christian answer.
That's right.
And
their apologists often become the Christian public intellectuals.
They are probably more so than anyone else. Yeah.
And so, I mean, all of these questions are really, I mean, I'm really looking forward to the workshop next week. It's going to be a really interesting couple of days. It's such a shame that people are locked down in other states and they can't come. We're going to have a cohort from Victoria coming up and so on. But it's going to be really good. And the whole field of the intellectual history of Christianity in Australia and the US, the interactions between those is something that still feels like quite a new area. So it's exciting that's being opened up.
That's what it's about. Yeah.
And so it's been great to chat to you today, Mike. Thanks for coming on to the Millis Podcast. Really appreciate it. And thank you to our listeners and viewers. We'll see you all again soon.